Welcome to the Subrecipient Invoice Approvals in Pathways webinar. So a few things. Again, my name is Chris DeVries. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm the project manager for the Research Administration Advisory Council, or RAC as it is known. My contact information is here, and I would urge you to contact me if you have any questions after this webinar. I'd be happy to help answer any questions about the functionality or how I can help assist the project teams as needed. So what we plan to cover today, we'll give a little bit of background information about the system, about how we got to where we are. We'll talk about some of the specifics with the implementation. We'll walk through a little bit what the approval process looks like, and we'll perform a system demonstration using the QA system. For those who are familiar with ITS systems, this is not the live system, so we won't actually be using live data, but as you see the system demonstrated is how it will look when it is live. We'll talk about some ways that you can prepare and some best practices, and we'll leave some time for question and answer. And so on that note, I would like to say, please add your questions to the chat. We will be monitoring those as we go throughout the presentation. I'll do my best to address them as they come up, but I have to tell you that a lot of the questions you might have will probably be answered in the slides that I'm presenting and in the demonstration. So I'll really devote a lot of the time for Q&A at the end. If you wouldn't please mind muting your audio and video, that will help us, especially with the recording afterwards. And I do want to mention that this webinar session is being recorded. It will be available after the fact, and we are working on including that video with some additional resources that should help you with preparation for the implementation. So I'll get started here. A little bit of history about how we got to where we are. For those of you who know, the Research Administration Advisory Council is comprised of different subcommittees that work on various projects. The RAC Process Subcommittee commissioned a work group back in August 2018 to look at some enhancements that could be made to the process within the Office of Contract Administration, or OCA. Two recommendations that came out of that were automating electronic routing of invoices for research team for approvals, automating invoice approval through Pathways. As a result of that group's work, another work group was formed in October of 2019 to look at the system Pathways and determine how those two recommendations could be addressed and met. And I owe a huge debt of gratitude to that work group. Their insight and input helped us really design a process that was not too far from the business process today, and as well as working within some of the constraints within the Pathways system as we move an already in place workflow to this particular process. The project is a joint effort really between the Office of Contract Administration and Information and Technology Services, ITS, with project management support and input from the RAC. And again, the work group that was formed in October 2019 really helped us with that input. So when will the implementation take place? Beginning October 10, 2020, any subrecipient invoices that are received by the university will be subject to the new approval process in Pathways. Any invoices processed prior to November 10th will be subject to the current process. And we'll talk a little bit about what that current process is in a few slides. One thing to remember, under Uniform Guidance, or UG, subrecipient invoices should be paid within 30 days. So really what this means is that not everyone is going to need to take action on November 10th. So please bear that in mind as you're preparing for the implementation and any business process changes that you'll need to make in that regard. So why are we doing this? Well, the current state has steps which are completed both within and outside of the Pathways system. In the future state, we want to move all of those steps to the Pathways system. And really what this means is that there's going to be increased efficiency. There will be not a need to pull documents out of the system and put them back into the system. So effectively what we've done is we've made this a process that is contained within a single system. So another reason for the change speaks to compliance. So all of the approvals and documentation, for example, invoices or other supporting documentation, will be contained in one location. And this brings the approval process in compliance with the SPG, the Standard Practice Guide. For those of you who know, there's a clause in SPG 500.01, which states that the PI is the individual with the ultimate responsibility for the administrative and programmatic aspects of the project, including ensuring funds are spent in accordance with university and sponsor guidelines. Additionally, the concurrence receipt, which is part of the current process, states that that individual who is signing that concurrence receipt has knowledge that the work was performed and that the charges associated with the invoice being approved are correct. And again, I want to stress that it's not just that the charges are okay, that the chart field information is okay, it's actually that the work has been completed. So what this does is it helps increase compliance and record keeping for the university, especially in cases of audit. Really what this means for the study teams is that all that information is going to be accessible and available to sponsored programs. So if those charges are part of a UG audit, sponsored programs should have most, if not all, of the information that they need. Another reason for the change is that we're bringing this in line with other electronic approvals that study teams or principal investigators already perform. Those are approvals such as approving proposal approval forms in the ERPM system, disclosing conflicts of interest through the MInform system, or approving travel or business hosting expenses through the Concur system. Another reason that this change is being made is it allows for remote approvals that happen quickly, and especially as the university moves toward allowing various types of approvals on a variety of different devices, this will help bring us in line with those particular processes. So really what this means is that we're providing some consistency for those electronic approvals for faculty and staff, as well as for the ability to access those approvals in many different situations, which given the current pandemic might actually be a net benefit for the faculty and those staff who are helping to approve these. So let's talk about who's going to be impacted by this change. There are really two groups that are going to be impacted. The first group is anyone who is currently approving subrecipient invoices through the concurrence receipt process right now. And that could include the 5 different roles that you see here: the contact PI in ERPM, the primary post-award administrator in ERPM, the sub-K or subcontract managing investigator in ERPM, the sub-K managing administrator in ERPM, and the single administrative point of contact, also known as the SAPOC, in mPathways Financials. A second group that's going to be impacted by the change is anyone who will be required to approve after November 10th. And that includes any principal investigators or project directors on project grants where there are open purchase orders associated with subrecipient agreements on contracts or grants. From a system standpoint, what that means is if a purchase order has an origin of OCA, or the Office of Contract Administration, any PI or SAPOC listed on those project grants will be required to approve the subrecipient invoices in the new process. This also includes any ad hoc approvers who may be part of the current process, or any alternate approvers who the PI or SAPOC designate in the new system. So, how can we help with the change management? First of all, we've provided a list of mismatches here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the demonstration, as well as some ways that you can prepare. A list of mismatches between the contacts in ERPM who are currently receiving the concurrence receipts versus those who will be required. So one of the things that you can do to prepare is to really make sure you're aligning those individuals in those roles. And we'll talk more about that as we get through the presentation. We did provide a list of these mismatches to the RAC committee at large that was shared earlier this week, and we're happy to share that with those who may be impacted. We're also developing resources to assist faculty and staff in this process. One of those items is a crosswalk document, which will take all of the fields currently shown on the concurrence receipt and indicate where those fields may be found in the voucher approval framework within mPathways. Another resource that we're developing is a quick overview of changes for both SAPOCs and PIs, really just letting them know the nature of the change and how the process will change for them within the new system. Additionally, we're happy to consult with project teams as needed, and this could include how to prepare for the change, as well as providing support both during and after the implementation. From a personal standpoint, I will say that I am happy to meet with any and all project teams that need assistance with this. And if that includes getting on a Zoom call with someone or otherwise helping to walk through what that approval process looks like once the implementation occurs, I'd be happy to do that. My contact information was on the first slide, so please don't hesitate to reach out to me. So let's talk a little bit about what's changing. In the current state, accounts payable will receive an invoice from that subrecipient and key the information into mPathways. They then route that invoice to the Office of Contract Administration, who reviews and approves the invoice based on the contract terms, and OCA then generates a concurrence receipt, which is essentially a report that is pulling information from the mPathways system. OCA then sends that concurrence receipt via email to the contacts that I mentioned before, either contacts in ERPM or in mPathways financials, depending on how that subcontract is set up. The project team will review that concurrence receipt, sign it, and send it back to the Office of Contract Administration. OCA then reviews that concurrence receipt, approves the invoice for payment in the mPathways system, and then that invoice is routed to accounts payable, who performs any final checks that are needed before that payment is remitted. Those final checks could include things like wire payment information or payments to foreign vendors, where there may be additional steps needed before the actual payment goes out. In the future state, system access, as I alluded to before, system access will be granted automatically to those individuals who will be required to approve, which includes the SAPOC and the PI on any project grant with an open purchase order that has an origin of OCA. So I want to reiterate that that access will be granted on a nightly basis through a batch process. So in terms of the SAPOC and the PI, there's no additional access that will need to be requested by anyone who fills those roles. Under the new process, accounts payable will still receive the invoice and key information into mPathways. That invoice will then be routed to OCA, who will review and approve it based on the contract terms. And once they approve it, an email will go to the SAPOC. The SAPOC reviews and approves that invoice in mPathways, adding additional approvers into the workflow as needed. Once the SAPOC approves that invoice, an email will go to the principal investigator. That principal investigator will again review and approve the invoice, adding additional approvers as needed. And I do want to mention that as those invoices are sitting, waiting for approval, system reminders will go out to either the SAPOC or the principal investigator, depending on whomever is required to approve, at both 14 and 28 days. Finally, once the PI approves that invoice, accounts payable will perform a final compliance check and remit the payment. And again, those checks may include, the final checks may include foreign vendor payments or wire payments or any other checks that are needed before the payment is actually issued. So what's changing, and this is a key change, although this is a change that occurred quite some time ago. So hopefully it's not new information for folks, but it is worth noting. In order to access this system, SAPOCs and principal investigators will need to use Duo two-factor authentication to actually log into mPathways and approve the invoices. However, Duo two-factor authentication has been required for faculty, staff, and student employees since January of 2019. So we're almost 2 years past that implementation. And again, hopefully this isn't new information for anyone. If you'd like more information about Duo or how to access the systems using various means, be that a mobile device, a token, or other means, there's a website here provided by ITS, and they would be happy to help you with any questions. Another key change is the actual routing, which is probably the reason why most people are here today, which really speaks to a business process change for most people. And that is currently the concurrence receipt reports are sent to those who are listed in the following roles. The contact PI in ERPM, unless there's a sub-K managing investigator, the primary post-award administrator in ERPM, unless there's a sub-K managing administrator, and the project grant administrator in M-Pathways Financials, also known as the Sapoc. I've included two screenshots here, one from the ERPM system, where you can see what the contact information might look like in a particular subcontract, as well as a snapshot from a statement of activity, which shows the project grant administrator as well. So again, these are the individuals who may currently be receiving a concurrence receipt and be part of that process, who may or may not, depending on what we talk about here in the future state, be automatically receiving the approval emails in M-Pathways under the new process beginning November 10th. So under that new process, only those individuals with the following roles will receive the notifications to approve a subrecipient invoice. And that includes the project grant director, unless that project grant director has assigned an alternate approver, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, both in the demonstration and in a few more slides. And the project grant administrator in M-Pathways, again, unless that project grant administrator has assigned an alternate approver. As I mentioned, project grant administrators and directors may include additional approvers as needed. And when additional approvers are added to the workflow, they will also receive an email when it is their turn to approve. So these are the individuals who will receive the notifications in the new system. At this point, I'm going to go through a bit of a demonstration, and I again encourage you to ask questions in the chat. We'll do our best to answer those at the end of the presentation. So if you bear with me here, let me just make sure that I have all of my information set. So the first thing I want to show, and I hope that you can all see the email that has popped up here. We tested this before, so if it's not working, please let me know and we'll make sure we correct it. This is a standard email that comes from the M-Pathways system that gives some cursory information about that voucher, as well as a hyperlink to go into the system and approve that voucher. What I'm demonstrating to you today is, again, the QA system. So this is not a live system. This is not live data, but the way that this system is laid out and the functionality will be what you see when the system goes live on November 10th. This is what we call the approval framework, and this is going to be the main work area for anything related to approving the subrecipient invoices. The first thing I'd like to call your attention to is the documents area. You have the ability to add documents and view documents. As part of their process, accounts payable will be adding, as they do today, any voucher or invoice information that's related to this particular charge. Excuse me just one second. So here's two-factor authentication. I didn't think I was going to have to demonstrate it, but here we go. So this is, again, a good way for folks to get a full picture of the process. Once you log in behind Duo two-factor authentication, you will be able to see, again, the documents. We simply have a placeholder here, but this will be the invoice that accounts payable is loading into M-Pathways. They currently do this now, but again, that's not something that's seen by the project teams. Project teams can also add additional documents as needed. Perhaps there are supporting documents that are not in invoice, but that help maybe for audit purposes. So again, that information can be added here. As I mentioned, the first step in this approval process is the SAPOC, the single administrative point of contact. One thing you may do, and we would advise that you do this if you need to, especially if you have a principal investigator who is used to seeing that concurrence receipt report, there is a hyperlink right here to generate that concurrence receipt. When clicking the link, it will take you into a report area, which most of you have probably seen before. You'll need to select a run control ID for that specific report that you're running. Put in the voucher ID. It asks for a range, but our advice is to just add one voucher ID. Click the Run button. Once you do that, the process scheduler request will ask you how you want that report to be output. As the system goes through its work, it will generate that concurrence receipt. And one thing I can say is that this concurrence receipt that's being generated today should mirror and look exactly like the concurrence receipts that you currently receive. And again, if you have principal investigators who really would like to see this information, one thing you may do is generate the concurrence receipt. It's generated as a PDF, save that as a PDF, and come back into the approval framework and actually add that document to the approval framework so that it's there for the principal investigator to reference. Other things that are important to look at on this particular tab are the amounts that are shown here, as well as the supplier information. That's key, that information that's on this first page that you should be reviewing. The line information will give you some additional information, including the purchase order ID. The charge information will give you the short code or chart field information that's associated with this particular purchase order. And I do want to demonstrate one thing, which is not very intuitive, but from our testing, we heard that some of the key information on the concurrence receipt is information that relates to the amount of the purchase order and how much of that purchase order might be remaining. There is a way to get this. We will be demonstrating this in the crosswalk document that we're providing, and it will be in our resources as well. But when you click this update chart fields link, and I want to stress that updating chart fields is not possible for a SAPOC or a PI. So it's a bit of a misnomer, but I want to say that this is how you can get to that purchase order information. When you click the update chart fields link, you'll be opening a screen that gives you a lot more information about that voucher. The default will be to open in the invoice information tab. And if you scroll down, you'll see there's a box here that says purchase order. When you click on the hyperlink that's there, it will open up another window, which will give you, again, a little bit of high-level information about that purchase order. When you click the PO activity summary link, that will open up a new tab in your browser, but you will then be able to access the information that you see here. The merchandise amount, which is the original amount of that purchase order, and how much of that has been invoiced. Again, we heard that this was key information that a lot of the study teams use to verify how the purchase order is being used. So that's one way that you can get that information. It is also possible to get that information by clicking on the update chart fields link in the approval tab. The process is the same, so there are two different ways to get that. There's nothing else here in the charge information that I would advise reviewing. I think we covered most of that. So once we get back into the approval tab, again, provided all the information that's shown here is correct and the work has been completed, the single administrative point of contact, or SAPOC, has the ability to approve a voucher. Approving that voucher is as simple as clicking the approve button. And you can see now that the status here has changed to approved. And you can also see that this has been routed to the project director for approval. Clicking on this comments link down here will tell you who actually in OCA performed the initial approval on that. And again, bear in mind that this is a test environment, so this is not live information. I also want to demonstrate another way to access any of the invoices that might be awaiting your approval, and that's through the work list. When you click on the compass, or what is called the nav bar up in the top right-hand corner of the approval framework, and click the button that says work list, it will bring you into your designated work list, everything that is awaiting your approval. Bear in mind, this work list includes everything that's needed for approval, not just subrecipient invoices. If I click on a specific voucher in this work list, it will again bring me back into the approval framework, much as we saw before. What I want to demonstrate now is if that voucher payment should not be paid, if we need to actually hold that payment. So the process for that is a little bit different. Obviously, we will not be approving that. After we've done our review of what's in the system, of whether the work has been performed, and let's just say, for example, that in this instance, the deliverable that we were expecting from that subrecipient institution was not actually delivered. In this case, we want to come to this box here, which says, I do not agree, select a reason below. When you click on the magnifying glass, it will bring up a pop-up window that has 5 different reasons. We've created a reason that should only be used for this purpose, and none of the other reasons should be selected, and that is dispute subaward or hybrid payment. As you can see from the description, this option should be used for subaward or hybrid contract payments only. Additionally, a notification will be sent to the Office of Contract Administration, and they will be reaching out to you to make sure if there's anything that they can do to help with making sure that invoice is correct. Selecting this option brings up another pop-up window which indicates that comments are required. And this will help, again, for audit purposes. It will also help if you want to give information to the Office of Contract Administration. But additionally, it can help with you just having some additional information about that workflow. So let's say, for instance, that the deliverable was not received. And that's our reason for holding this payment. You'll note that hold payment is the only button I have here. Again, because we are working in a framework that's designed for other business processes, the deny payment actually brings it back to a different point in the workflow, which we do not want to have in this case. So simply holding the payment prevents that payment from moving forward. When I click the hold payment button, after the system refreshes, that information will be shown in the comments. So anyone who comes in to access this voucher after the fact will be able to see that there is a reason why this payment was held. I'll let the system do its refresh right now. And again, what this will do is send an email to OCA. OCA will see that this payment has been held, and they will know why it has been held. And so again, the comments may be used if perhaps there's an issue that needs to be resolved with the subrecipient. Those comments can be used to indicate that in the system. Not entirely sure why this is taking a little bit longer than expected, but just be assured that when you do select the hold payment button and add comments, those comments will appear back in the voucher approval framework. Now you can see that I'm being given a message that says this voucher has been put on hold. When I click into the comments, you can see that when I added this comment, it's shown that there was a non-approval, and the reason is here in the comments. I'd also like to demonstrate how you may add an additional approver to the framework. So I'll do that using another email that's generated from the system. And let's just say, for instance, maybe I have a lab manager or someone else who really looks at the invoice, who can also verify that the work has been done, but is maybe an intermediary step between myself as a SAPOC and the principal investigator. Again, what I can do here, you can see the comments are available. There's a plus button here that's green for those who are able to see it. It will bring up another window, and I may search for any other individual, and we'll talk about this in another slide. Any individual who has specific roles in the MPathway system. These are roles that can be requested through ORS. We'll talk about what those roles are, and I would imagine that most folks already may have this role. So you can either use the magnifying glass or type in the individual's unique name. Bear in mind that those unique names need to be entered in all capitals. Select that individual, click the insert button, and when the system refreshes, you'll see that I've added an additional approver into the workflow. As you can see, it has not yet been routed to that individual. I can also add additional approvers to the workflow as needed. When I click the approve button, the system will refresh and my approval will be there, and you'll be able to see that the invoice has now been routed to that secondary approver. Once that approval is made on my end, the individual who I add into the workflow will receive a system notification with a hyperlink, much like I demonstrated, and will be able to go in and approve that invoice as they need to. Once the individual who's in the workflow approves, then it will go on to the next individual. be that another approver or the principal investigator. So that's a little bit about the SAPOC approval. I'll demonstrate now how the principal investigator will approve these. We'll make sure we make up some time here. So
thank you.
This is the approval framework, as I was mentioning. One thing that I wanted to mention is that it's possible to view the documents. I'll demonstrate that here, and I hope this comes up. And Raquel, maybe if you could just privately message me to make sure that all of these, you can see all these screens. So again, this would be an invoice that's added to the approval framework. If you need to generate that concurrence receipt, there's a process here which I went through before. And again, this is similar to running a report in mPathways as you normally would. The process will run. And I don't know if you can see my pop-up. Again, I sincerely apologize. We tested this, so I'm not quite sure what's happening. This is sort of the run control process that you may go through with any other type of report that you're running in mPathways. Someone could help me out and make sure, did we?
It's
okay.
showing.
Okay, well, so I think I just got a chat that the SAPOC approval process seemed to have displayed okay. It's just when we went to the PI approval. Okay, I'm getting a few more. So, all right, so thanks. I'll show what that's, let me go back to the PI approval here. So now that the PI has this voucher for approval, again, the SAPOC approval is shown in the system. And if someone could let me know that they're able to see this, I would appreciate that. The difference here for the principal investigator is that they have the attestation statement. The attestation statement will need to be agreed to by checking the box that says I agree before the approval button is active. So once you check once the SAPOC or the PI, excuse me, checks that approval, I agree box and selects the approval button, the attestation statement appears in the comments. So this is, again, a way that we've bolstered sort of the audit and documentation functionality of the system. The principal investigator will have access to view any of the other information that I demonstrated with the SAPOC. But again, they will also have they will need to sign the attestation statement. As I mentioned, the faculty member or the principal investigator may still access the approval through the work list. And that will happen exactly as the SAPOC does. The principal investigator also has the ability to deny or put a payment on hold if needed. And that could, again, be for any of the reasons. Oh, I clicked into the wrong one here, but suffice to say, it will be the same for the principal investigator. They have the ability to hold a payment if needed. They'll need to enter a comment about why that payment is being held. Perhaps a deliverable wasn't received or the subrecipient institution did not do the work. And so the PI will then have the ability to hold that payment. One other thing I'd like to demonstrate is what I talked about in terms of adding alternate approvers. To do this, you'll need to use the nav bar and go to the navigator option. When you scroll down, anyone who has access in mPathways to this framework will have this setup financials / supply chain link. Then clicking on the approval profile and clicking approval profile again will bring you into this page, which allows you to designate what is called an alternate user or an alternate approver. To do that, you can enter the individual's unique name or use the magnifying glass to find that individual. Select that individual. Again, it requires all capital letters to be able to do that. Enter a starting date for that alternate approver, and an ending date for that. And once you enter that date, I'm not actually going to do it, but if you click save, that will delegate all of the workflow for this particular person, in this case me, to the individual I designate here. So that's again how we can add an alternate approver to have the workflow go. This is different than an additional approver, which I mentioned, which is adding someone to the workflow. So that's what I have for the demonstration. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to add those to the chat. We'll go through those here in a minute. And I hope my slides are being displayed right now. So what can you do to prepare? Thanks, Raquel. What can you do to prepare? So again, we mentioned Duo two-factor authentication. So please make sure whoever is going to be approving invoices has that capability. We would advise that you align the PI and the SAPOC on the project grant in Pathways to those individuals who should legitimately be approving the invoices. If you need assistance with changing the context on a project grant, you may contact your sponsor program's customer service coordinator associated with that project grant. And if you need to change a project grant that's associated with a purchase order, your OCA specialist on that contract can help you with that. One best practice that we would advise, and again, this can be facilitated by OCA once you actually have a sub-project grant set up, is if you have multiple subrecipients that you're working with and you want to set up sub-project grants for them. Again, OCA can help once you get those sub-project grants set up, can help align the project grant to that PO. We talked about adding ad hoc or additional approvers into the workflow as needed, but bear in mind that the SAPOC and the PI will still need to approve the invoice. The ad hoc approvers will need one of the following roles that's listed below. And again, most individuals may have this role, especially if they're in Pathways, but if not, those roles may be requested through ORS, the online access request system. You may use alternate approvers, but use them wisely. We just demonstrated how that worked. So one thing to bear in mind is that alternate approvers will receive all of the delegated workflow in Pathways. So the system does not have, we don't have an ability in the system to delineate or parse out which approvals go to the delegates. All of the approvals will go to that delegate for the designated time that's indicated, as I mentioned, or as I showed in the alternate user profile. Really, the expectation for alternate approvers is that they're temporary and they need to be assigned before the voucher actually routes. So that's an important piece to keep in mind. If someone is going on vacation or otherwise going to be out of contact, the best thing to do is to add or indicate an alternate approver before those vouchers come through the system. One other thing I will say, which I did not have on the slides, if there is a need, we understand that there will be emergencies that come up. If there's a need to either restart workflow or otherwise have something else happen with that voucher because of an emergency, our best advice is to work with OCA, and if needed, they can help work with accounts payable to do whatever is needed, whether it's restarting workflow or somehow otherwise accommodating an emergency situation. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions. What I will do right now, I'm going to go back through the chat and I'll kind of pull these as they came in. And some of them I may have already addressed, and I'll make sure. The first question I see is, can a PI assign a delegate to handle invoice approvals? That is correct, yes. One note on that, it's not possible for another individual to go in and delegate approvals on behalf of the PI. So what does that mean? If I'm a principal investigator, I will need to log into Pathways and go through the steps that I just demonstrated to assign an alternate approver for myself. So again, that's not something someone else can do. Next question, will the SAPOC be notified once the invoice has gone through the entire approval process so that we know it has been signed by the PI and completed? It's my understanding that there are no notifications that will go out once the invoice is actually approved. Part of that was to avoid a lot of extra emails. But what I can say too, and I already have a note about this that from a question that came up yesterday, is I know OCA will be working on or has some reports that they use just for their own business processes. So in one of my upcoming meetings, I plan to talk to them about what reports might be available and might be able to be shared with project teams so that they can help identify both invoices that are still needing approval and where those might be in the approval process, as well as potentially seeing the ones that are approved. So I'll definitely take that question away, and we'll be sure to see what we can do to address that. Another question, will the SAPOC be able to see the status of concurrence after the SAPOC approves? They should be able to. I believe that you will still, again, by going through in the work list, as I demonstrated before, you'll be able to see where that particular invoice is in the approval process. My understanding is once it's all approved, it will drop off your work list. There should be other ways that you can access that information. And again, I'll take that away to make sure that we provide that information in our resources. Another question. Do I have to run the concurrence receipt to see what account number has been assigned? If you're talking about the short code or the chart field information, again, that will all be contained in the approval workflow or the framework, I should say. And if it's incorrect, if the project grant associated with that purchase order is incorrect, again, the best thing to do is to contact the OCA specialist assigned to that subcontract. And I apologize if the picture was not coming through. There was a question about sizing of the picture. So again, we'll be recording this, and so hopefully viewing it after the fact will do that. Another question, is there a simple way to just view the invoice from the sub-K so we can see the itemized detail from them? Yes, the accounts payable will be adding those invoices in the documents section of the approval framework. And so depending on whether how itemized the subrecipient has made that invoice, it will be what accounts payable has received. Question, do we have a job aid with screenshots? Yes, so there is, and I am working with ITS, so they have some online guides for this. They, for those folks who know, ITS has typically provided step-by-step guides, but they've moved most of those into more of an online format. And so, yes, we do have that. I will make sure to include that in the resources that we send after the webinar, as well as any other communications that we send to folks in terms of letting them know about the implementation. Another question, is the PI always included in the approval flow regardless of other approvers who have been included in the workflow? Yes, the principal investigator on that project grant will always be included in the approval workflow. And again, if there's a need to sort of realign who should be approving those, whether it's setting up a sub-project grant, then yes, the principal investigator associated with that project grant will always be required to approve. Another question, do faculty members have the appropriate ORS access to approve these? So provided they're a project or a principal investigator on that project grant, they will automatically be granted the access. So there's no need for them to have an ORS request submitted. The only need for an ORS request would be if you're adding an additional approver to the workflow. And let's just say that additional approver does not have one of the 4 roles that I showed on a previous slide. That's where an ORS request would need to be made for those individuals. But again, the SAPOC, the principal investigator on the project grant, will automatically be granted the access. So there was a question about the information that was sent to the RAC committee at large. Will affected projects be aware of POs that are being reviewed? I don't know that I understand the question, Anna. If it's a question of whether that will be a more targeted communication to those folks, that wasn't really our intent, but I would say if the folks on the webinar have a need to see that information, it's information that was shared with the committee at large. I certainly don't have a problem sharing it, and so you can review it and see if any of your particular purchase orders are affected or subcontracts are affected. So again, if you need that information, if anyone on the webinar needs that information, please contact me and I'd be happy to provide it. Otherwise, again, I hope that your RAC committee at large representative may have cascaded that information. We just sent it out earlier this week, and I know folks are busy, so perhaps it's still on its way. So, but if not, I'm happy to help with that. Does the university have a standard on alternate approvers for the PI? I expect an alternate approver for SAPOCs wouldn't be an issue. So I'll answer that question by stating what I said before, which is whoever can verify that the work has been done and that the charges are appropriate on that project grant, to the extent if, again, that's the PI on a project grant, and maybe you set up a sub-project grant, and maybe that's not the PI of the entire project. The university really expects that whoever's designated as the principal investigator on the project grant is able to affirm that the work has been done and that the charges are appropriate. Can a PI choose to list the SAPOC as their alternate so they don't ever have to approve these? No, that's not possible. It's not possible for someone to approve the same invoice twice. And it kind of goes back to what I said, and that's sort of in direct contradiction to the standard practice guide, which the PI should be approving those. Now, again, if there's a need for another person on that project team to approve, I don't believe that there's any stipulations against adding whomever you want as a principal investigator on that project, but I would urge some caution with that because your unit might not see that as an appropriate thing to do. Question, is it possible to just upload the PI's approval and then sign on their behalf? Unfortunately, there's not. Again, that would sort of be in line with the same answer that I gave before. Question, what is the best contact for OCA for emergencies? I'd have to defer to OCA. I think the best contact would be that OCA specialist who's listed on that subcontract, because they might have some direct knowledge of it. But I can take that question away and we'll make sure that if there's a general email address that can be sent to, which I believe there is, but I don't want to misspeak on what that is. So we'll take that away and we'll be sure to provide that information. How do we designate a research admin as the approver instead of the SAPOC? So that, again, can be done through the alternate approver process or by actually aligning the SAPOC on a project grant to the individual who should be approving. I also see some clarification here that accounts payable will be following up on delinquent vouchers as well. So there's sort of another check in the system besides just the emails that will be going out. So there's a question about potentially setting up a new ORS role for just this type of voucher approval. I see that the roles for ad hoc approvers are maybe not roles that we'd want to grant. We talked about this in our work group. I'd have to take it back to ITS, but if I recall, and based on my own understanding, I think it's that the work involved with creating a new role can be and is quite extensive. So at this point, we don't have that in the works, but I'll take that back and bring it back as a suggestion. There's a question about in Concur being able to set up backup approvers. And so there's, again, not a way to do this on a permanent basis, but only on a temporary basis. And it's for the reasons that I've already stated. A question about when an invoice is denied, who is notified beyond OCA? I believe it's just OCA that will be notified, since there's nothing that will actually move that invoice to the principal investigator. They will not be notified. And I believe even if the principal investigator denies that payment or holds that payment, there aren't any subsequent reminders or notifications, I should say, that will go out. And so, but I'll check on that because that could be helpful. So a question, is there a query that I can pull of all of the subcontracts so you can be proactive about sending the communication to the PIs? We have that information. So I mentioned the mismatches, and maybe I sort of misspoke, or it's actually a list of all of the subcontracts that are currently in the system, with the exception of ones that have been closed or canceled or deleted, and ones that are in pre-submission. So the list that was sent to the research and the RAC committee at large contains everything. What we did in it, though, is highlight and call out the mismatches specifically, so it's easy to sort and filter. But that does have all of the subcontracts from the system in that particular file. So I would advise, again, if you need a copy of that, we can certainly provide that. And I see there's a question about the PR department manager user role. I understand that that is an ORS role, although, and that information came from ITS, so I'll take that again as a question in terms of where you can find that role. So there's a question, if I approve as the SAPOC and the charges are acceptable, but the deliverable has not been received and the PI refuses to sign, what happens then? So that gets back to, again, putting that on payment hold. And I do want to be sensitive to our time, so we're coming up on the end here. So one thing, let me just make sure. So there was a question, just one quick follow-up. So if the PI if anyone, the SAPOC or the PI assigns a delegate, then that approval will go to that individual. So there's a little bit of a clarification there. We're talking about a delegate or an alternate approver, which is actually routing that workflow, versus an additional approver, which is adding someone to the workflow. So if you add an additional approver, that just means there's more people who need to approve, including the PI and the SAPOC. If you add an alternate approver, that means then if you have an alternate approver for the principal investigator, that individual will not be required to approve, but it will be routed to their delegate. And again, bear in mind, it will route all of that workflow to the delegate. And the final question I have here, is there a place to add a note to the PI so that they can review any comments prior to their approval? If you add comments in there, you may add whatever comments you like. And so those can be added in the comments section. If there is maybe other documentation that you have, perhaps you typically get an email from that subrecipient institution, you can add that email into the documents section. So yes, there are ways that the PI can sort of see comments or other information that may help with their review or review and approval. So I think I have all the questions. We'll make sure to go back through all of the chat questions and make sure we address any other questions that that we didn't get to. Thanks for bearing with us, especially with the technical glitch there. I appreciate it, but folks know that's the time that we're in. So again, thanks very much, and we'll be certain to follow up with the materials and the recording and any questions that we answered. So thanks a lot. Hope you all have a good day.